So Kamiya technically was unemployed since mid-October 2024, and literally exactly 2 months later is at the Game Awards announcing that he's working on the Okami sequel with a new studio with Capcom. How wild is that? At this year's Game Awards, to the surprise of many, the Okami sequel was announced. The original game came out in 2006, meaning that the sequel is long overdue 18 years later. In fact, the IP has been mostly dormant since 2012 when Okami HD came out. Hideki Kamiya was announced to be the director, which was surprise to many as he announced his departure from PlatinumGames late last year. This is the first we've heard of his activity for a year, and Capcom will work with his new studio's Clovers to make the Okami sequel. If you're a fan of PS2 Capcom games or PlatinumGames, Clover is a name that's familiar to you, since Clover was the original studio that made Okami. This studio, Clovers with an S, is a completely new studio and is independent from Capcom. And although at this time Clovers is independent, Clovers is said to be developing the core of games, and their business model right now is to rely on partnerships. So who knows, maybe Capcom and Clovers could work a lot more in the future and they could buy them out. We've seen this happen over and over again. Just like more recently Nintendo buying 100% of Monolith Software. You know, here on this channel we talk a lot about drama in the industry. So when I found out it wasn't Capcom reigniting Clover Studio, but actually Kamiya that created a Clover Studio or is leading a Clover Studio, I thought it was a direct jab to Inaba, who is the last of the original presidents at PlatinumGames. This whole lore runs deep and we'll go over it all. There's some underdog stories, some sad stories, but most importantly, stories that says a lot about the industry as a whole. I mean, you can even see Kamiya wearing a Clover shirt a year ago when he announced that he was leaving PlatinumGames. So I thought that this was a jab at Inaba. And technically, Kamiya didn't even create Clovers and was just hired by them a little over a month ago. But we'll cover that later when we get more in depth with the interview. First, we have to cover some of the backstory lore here between Inaba and Kamiya and why people think there's bad blood between them, which was sad to see since they have worked together to make legendary games in this industry, cult classics, almost for over 2 decades now. A quick backstory is that in 2006, after Capcom and Clover had made God Hand, a cult classic, Kamiya, Inaba, and Shinji Mikami went off to start Seed Inc. So these were all legends from Capcom. And in 2007, after these legendary creators left to start Seed Inc., Capcom shut down Clover Studio. In 2007, Seed Inc. merged with another company, Odd Inc., to create PlatinumGames. The owner of Odd Inc. was another legendary Capcom veteran, Tatsuya Minami, who worked on Super Ghouls and Ghosts and the Mega Man franchise. He would later be the reason that Metal Gear Solid Revengeance was made, since Hideo Kojima actually contacted Minami to make Metal Gear Rising Revengeance. But we'll get back to Minami later. He's important to this whole story with Okami. Back to the original 3, Shinji Mikami left PlatinumGames in 2010 after Vanquish, and there's a whole story there, but for the sake of this, we'll just summarize that he went on to make Tango Gameworks, the guys that have done Evil Within and Hi-Fi Rush. As some of you may know, Tango got bought by ZeniMax Bethesda, which then got bought by Xbox. Mikami left in 2023 to start his own studio, and Xbox shut down Tango Gameworks in 2024, where they were then bought by Krafton, the publishers of PUBG. You can imagine why Mikami left Tango. He wanted to work on games besides horror games, and also having your company bought twice must have felt like he didn't have much control over his company anymore. And that'll definitely be a running theme of this entire video and what is wrong with the gaming industry as a whole right now with all these buyouts. Back to PlatinumGames. Now, Tatsuya Minami, the original owner of Odd Inc., left PlatinumGames in 2016 after Star Fox Zero. The funny thing was the reason why Minami left Capcom to start Odd Inc. was because he was tired of working on sequels. But not one, but 2 of Minami's studios are now working on the Okami sequel. That being M2, who was known for working with Capcom on the Resident Evil remakes, and now this new studio, Machine Head Works, where their website was just created this month, December 2024. An RE4 remake is the flagship game on their website, and if we scroll to the bottom, we see Machine Head Works Inc. The president is Tatsuya Minami, and it's also based in Osaka, where Hideki Kamiya's Clover Studio is, and the original Capcom Clover Studio was. So now 2 of the original Capcom legends are working on the Okami sequel. So indie rogue studios that are supporting studios seem to be the way to go for these legendary industry players that don't like the creative siphoning of working for a larger producer or feel like their resources are regularly sapped or dissolved into the greater publisher. Think like Activision or what we just went over with Tango Gameworks. That was the original philosophy with PlatinumGames. You have all all these legendary Capcom heads making their own studios and then merging to make something greater. So it's really sad to see where it's come to now. So at this point, there were 2 presidents left at PlatinumGames, which was Hideki Kamiya, the creator of Bayonetta, director of Resident Evil 2, Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, and the original Okami, and Atsushi Inaba, the CEO of the original Clover studio, who developed Beautiful Joe, Okami, and God Hand, and he is the current owner of PlatinumGames. So Inaba and Kamiya literally worked together for 19 years before Kamiya surprisingly announced departing from PlatinumGames late last year. Cannot overstate how much of a shock this is, as quitting your job in Japanese culture is a huge deal, to the point that people hire resignation firms to cleanly resign from their job in Japan. Going over the backstory, you can see why I thought that Hideki Kamiya's Clovers Inc. was a big middle finger to Inaba after stepping down from PlatinumGames. What fueled these rumors is shortly after the Okami sequel was announced at the Game Awards, many PlatinumGames veteran developers removed PlatinumGames from their social media bios, insinuating that they left the company. Some of these include Kenji Sato, the director of Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance and Transformers Devastation; Takahashi Tora, who was the director of Astral Chain. Oh no, we're not getting an Astral Chain 2 now, are we? And Masaki Yamanaka, who is a designer and director for Anarchy Reigns. The timing was just way too coincidental. Kamiya already expressed that he doesn't feel like he has creative freedom at PlatinumGames anymore, and maybe many others have as well. PlatinumGames is a legendary studio that defied the odds of breaking out of a very large company like Capcom, merging independent studios with other independent former Capcom veterans, getting deals with Sega, Nintendo, Tencent, and Square Enix. Now to potentially being so big that people don't want to work there anymore. It's really not looking good for PlatinumGames, but it is Inaba's company at this point. Capcom also announced a new Onimusha game at the Video Game Awards. This is also the first new game since 2012, Onimusha Soul, not including a VR game. Capcom then announced in a press release, in addition to regular releasing major new titles each year, Capcom is focusing on reactivating dormant IPs that haven't had a new title launched recently. The company is working to further enhance corporate value by leveraging its rich library of content, which includes reviving past IPs like the 2 titles announced at the Game Awards, in order to continuously produce higher efficient, high quality titles. This obviously got a lot of people excited now that Capcom is working with Kamiya and Clover's studio, the spiritual successor to Clover Games. Maybe we can get a new Beautiful Joe since Kamiya is there, maybe a new God Hand. And the funny thing is, if we get a new Beautiful Joe, that would be another slap in the face to Inaba and PlatinumGames, since PlatinumGames is working on Project G.G, which is said to be the final of the hero trilogy between Beautiful Joe, Wonderful 101, and Project G.G. It was actually the direction of Project G.G itself that was cited to be one of the reasons why Kamiya left PlatinumGames. I think reviving IPs is a smart way to go. It's safe and generates a lot of interest in a time where the gaming bubble has essentially burst. We also see Sega is reviving a lot of dormant IPs like Virtua Fighter 6 being announced at the Game Awards, and the whole AA between AAA games is Nintendo's whole claim to fame. This whole year has basically been AA games and reviving dormant IPs for Nintendo. Sony, take notes. Your Scrimblow Blimblow game Astrobot won Game of the Year. Let's start bringing back those PlayStation Studio classics. Or I don't know, Jak and Daxter, some of the Naughty Dog IPs too. And then there's companies like Ubisoft that finally got something right, with Prince of Persia and the Lost Crown being a AA game, yet they completely dissolved the team when the game didn't reach expectation. And you wonder why these veterans of the industry are going and making their own studio, and then working with the very publisher or company that they left in the first place because they didn't have freedom. In fact, in the interview we're about to go over, Kamiya himself says, hey, he would be okay with working with PlatinumGames again with Clover's studio. In a tell-all interview with DenFami Eco Gamer Japan, Kamiya says that he felt like PlatinumGames was always Inaba's company, which was really sad to see. But he felt like Inaba was the brains and he was the muscle. This is a long interview. It tells a lot about the situation, clears a lot of things up, and I'm really glad this dropped in the middle of me getting info for this video. This interview is in Japanese. I'm reading it through Google Translate. If any of you have corrections and can read Japanese, please let me know. And also, I'm sorry for my terrible pronunciation of Japanese names this whole video. During this interview, we find out about the guy sitting next to Kamiya in the Game Awards, and this is going to be a very important character in gaming history if the Okami sequel does good and many Capcom IPs are revived with Clover's Inc. Thanks to Kanato Koyama. We wouldn't be here without him, and he is a co-founder of Clover. All right, let's get into this interview. Who is he and why, if you're a fan of old Capcom PS2 action games, you should be so thankful to this man. Koyama worked with Kamiya in PlatinumGames, and Koyama invited Kamiya to start a studio with him when he quit his job. The interviewer asked, how did they establish Clovers Inc. and when they decided to leave PlatinumGames? Did you already have the idea of starting a new studio? Kamiya said no, he had no idea or plans of doing anything after leaving PlatinumGames. He just had to get out. The decision was made in July 2023. He says his ideas about creativity and the company's future direction were at odds. He had discussions with Inaba for about 3 months, but they just couldn't come to an agreement. So it was in April and May that Inaba and Kamiya had conflicting positions and many detailed discussions trying to find a compromise. He goes on to say, it wasn't a fight or breakup, nor were we yelling at each other. Kamiya said he really refrained from using the word quit because he felt like that was a threat or that it would be weaponized. But when the word was said, they knew there was no going back. Kamiya told the producer of Project G.G. and Koyama about his resignation first, and Koyama asked, Kamiya-san, what are you gonna do from now on? And he didn't really think of it. It wasn't like I was quitting because I wanted to do something or that I had already received another job. That is wild. That the disagreements between Inaba and Kamiya were so bad that he just left. He didn't even think like, oh, I'm gonna go and do things my way, or I have an opportunity over here. No, I just wiped his hands clean. He's like, I can't do this anymore. And as we'll see later, Kamiya always thought of PlatinumGames as Inaba's company, so they couldn't even agree to disagree, and he ended up leaving. That tells me there wasn't a compromise at all if he had to leave with no backup plan. And again, I stress that quitting your job in Japan is very different culturally than how it is in the West. And judging on my audience demographic, most of us are Western viewers. The interviewer basically asked what happens after that. And you decided to leave simply because you had different directions? Kami said, yeah, but it was something I decided purely in discussion with Inaba. Kamiya, now over 50, thought of himself as a troublesome guy. The rugged Kamiya told Koyama, who asked what would he do after quitting, that if there's a place that will accept me, I'll continue making games. But if not, I'll go back to my parents' house. Then Koyama invited me saying, Kamiya-san, if that's the case, why don't you join us? After that, I let the whole company know that I was leaving. There was still some time before I actually left, so during that time, some staff members came to talk to me individually, and some even said, I came to PlatinumGames because of you, Kamiya, which surprised Kamiya because he thought that he was just an old nuisance. And we'll see that the core 20 people that are now working at Clovers Inc., some of them could have potentially been those people that Kamiya and Koyama reached out to and said, hey, you're cool, join Clovers. Right now, they have 20 people, but they want to grow to develop the quote-unquote core of games in-house while leaning on larger studios to license them to work on these big games, but they want to be at the core of it. So basically, if there's a Clovers Inc. funded game or partnered game, they want to be the directors, and I think that's an interesting approach. We'll see how that goes because like working with Nintendo is notorious for micromanaging. We saw that where some people left retro games during Metroid Prime because of the micromanagement. And even with the new Mario and Luigi Brothership, the game was about to take a totally different character design when it comes to Mario and Luigi, but Nintendo had to reel it back. Kamiya said he enjoyed working with Nintendo, so I'm actually curious of how this will play out because they are setting the studio up like they want to be the directors. Kamiya said there were many people that came up to him after he announced that he was quitting within PlatinumGames that said, I'd like to work with you again somewhere. I was thinking of asking a company to let me work there or exploring the possibility of working as a freelancer like the creator of Nier, Yoko Taro. But as I was talking to these people, I suddenly realized that rather than working alone, maybe I should create a place where I could make games together with people like those who reached out to me when they left their company. So there he's referencing people that he hired within PlatinumGames, right? The whole PlatinumGames started off as the rogue Capcom developers. And I guess Platinum got too big and now Kamiya went rogue and other people wanted to join him. He then goes on to say, however, I have always been a person who has been working on site, so I don't know anything about starting a company. At that time, I remembered what Koyama had said, which was the trigger for founding Clover. So Koyama was really behind this whole thing. This wouldn't be the case if it wasn't for Koyama. Koyama said, actually, I was the one who approached him, so of course I was prepared for it. As we discussed earlier, when Kamiya said he might go back to his hometown, I thought, that's not gonna happen. I also thought that Project G.G, which Kamiya directed, was a really interesting game. The interviewer asked, was Project G.G halted because Kamiya left PlatinumGames? Kamiya says that's up to PlatinumGames, we don't know. It's a shame that we can't release it to the world with our own hands. That's wild that we had Viewtiful Joe, Wonderful 101, and Project G.G was supposed to be the finale of this hero trilogy. And now Kamiya isn't going to be around to make it. All right, so who is this guy, Koyama? I actually started at Mario Club as a playtester to enter the game industry. But he found out that working at Mario Club and debugging Nintendo games didn't have a lot of career potential for him to be a developer or a game director. He ended up getting a job at DNA Games in Osaka, who was hiring for a position with no experience at the time. Wow. Where are those jobs where people are hiring with no experience? DNA, if you don't know, is a mobile game developer behind a lot of the modern Nintendo apps. Most recently, the Pokemon TCG app, Pokemon Masters, Fire Emblem, Heroes, Mario Run. That's all DNA. After working at DNA, Koyama worked at PlatinumGames right around the time that Scalebound was canceled. Then he was assigned the game called World of Demons, which was a mobile game that was a partnership with DNA, which is why he got the role, because he was a former DNA employee. That project released in 2018, but then was pulled and DNA dropped the project for then Platinum to release it fully in Apple Arcade in 2021. After 2018, where the project was postponed, was when Koyama actually left PlatinumGames. And the next part of this story is actually wild. So Koyama went on to be a manager at Donuts. And it was through this manager role that he would gain the experience to actually be able to start Clover's Inc. Donuts is not an actual donut company. It looks like it's a cloud service provider company for games, video live streams, medical, and media. While working as a manager at Donuts, he got a call from a PlatinumGames developer saying, hey, do you want to go out to dinner with Kamiya? And he first declined, but felt like my manager job is so easy that I can actually do this just 2 days a week. So Donuts actually let him work just 2 days a week. That gave him the time to do freelance work for PlatinumGames, and then gradually fully worked at PlatinumGames to work with Kamiya for 3 years. Kamiya said that it was actually him that directly asked to invite Koyama to dinner. At the time, he was thinking of designing the game Project G.G with both action aspects and completely different gameplay. Kamiya understood the key points of an action game, but when it came to the aspects of the game that were different from action, I needed someone like Koyama who had not been at PlatinumGames until then. All right, this is the really funny part. The interviewer asked, okay, so you guys were working together, but on the other hand, when you left PlatinumGames, Kamiya, you said you were unemployed. Was there some kind of contract restriction in that? Koyama answered for Kamiya, saying that he had a non-compete agreement for 1 year, so we had to abide by that with PlatinumGames, meaning that Koyama's Clovers Inc. and Kamiya didn't actually sign a contract, and they didn't work together. They just made preparations. Kamiya left PlatinumGames on October 12th, 2023. We had him join us this year, October 13th, 2024, exactly 1 year after he left PlatinumGames, and that's when Clovers Inc. really got started. So Kamiya technically was unemployed since mid-October 2024, and literally exactly 2 months later is at the Game Awards announcing that he's working on the Okami sequel with a new studio with Capcom. How wild is that? Does the non-compete even matter if someone is doing all the work for you and then you just hop on, I'm leading? Like, come on, you're telling me there's no bad blood between him and Inaba? That's hilarious. Kamiya says, for the first time I spoke with Koyama, we frequently discussed our future direction. However, in order to comply with the non-compete agreement with PlatinumGames, I left the actual creation of the company, the office contract, and the recruitment of members to work with me with Koyama. So Koyama started the company and then just 2 months ago hired, quote unquote, hired Kamiya to actually lead the studio. Kamiya says they made sure to keep in mind that I was completely unemployed, and they created a structure that would allow me to join after I had completed my atonement to, I guess, Inaba PlatinumGames. And this is where Kamiya shed some light into his thoughts at PlatinumGames. I thought if I continued working here, my artistic spirit will die. To put it bluntly, 90% of my focus was on-site development. So originally as vice president president, Kamiya was hardly active at all. So he says he's more of a creator than a VP at PlatinumGames. And it looks like it's going to be the same at Clovers Inc. So Kamiya is a designer and a director through and through. He's not really a publisher or a manager type, it seems. So again, shout out to Koyama for working with donuts to learn the managerial skills to create Clovers Inc. Kamiya says, things have progressed to the point where I was no longer able to express my creative commitment. I decided that I could no longer keep my name with the company, PlatinumGames. Ooh. Kamiya says, from the beginning, I've thought of PlatinumGames as the company and that it's Inaba's company. That if you compare the company to a person, Inaba is the brains of the company, and among them, I wanted to be the muscle that exerts the most powerful force. That's how I wanted the collective known as PlatinumGames to be able to compete in the gaming industry. The signals sent from the cerebrum are essentially for muscles. At the same time, those signals must be reliable for muscles. Until then, I had received those signals, trusted them, and worked to maximize my own strengths. But with regard to the future direction of PlatinumGames, with Inaba at the helm, I was no longer able to place my trust in them and exert my strength as a muscle. So there again, Kamiya is saying that he is more of a designer and a director, and when you don't trust the president or the producer of these games, or that his creative input isn't there at all, that's why he left. Whereas with Koyama, Clovers Inc. would literally be nothing without Kamiya. I mean, my initial reaction, I thought that Capcom just revived Clover Studio and hired Kamiya, but that wasn't the case at all. Here the interviewer asks, I'd like to ask about Clovers Inc. The first thing that stuck out to me was the name Clovers. It reminds me of Clover Studios that produced games like Viewtiful Joe, God Hand, and Okami. Koyama stepped in and said the name Clovers was suggested by Kamiya. To be honest, I thought it would be bad if we just continued to drag on the name Clover Studio. However, when I saw Kamiya write Clovers on the whiteboard at that time, I intuitively thought this has a different meaning. When I first saw the words, I thought it would be read as Sea Lovers or Lovers of Sea. The interviewer asked about funding. Kamiya says that it's going to have to be project financing. I guess you could think about the fan funding that was behind a wonderful 101 ports. Kamiya insists that this is about independence. In order to focus on creating unique and creative works, we need to be in a position where we are less susceptible to interference from our investors. So they currently have 20 members. Their development strategy is to cooperate with external parties rather than doing everything ourselves. Kamiya says he's not interested in AAA titles. In terms of categories, he would play some larger scale titles, such as AA titles. Here's where he says he'd want Clovers to increase to about 70 people in staff, and that way they can develop the core of these games in-house. Obviously, then that means that it would be easiest for them to use a general game engine like Unreal Engine so that they can more easily work with these other companies. Here he says, one more thing we value as a company is to fully promote the creator's artistic talent and incorporate it into our game. This is exactly the reason why I decided to leave PlatinumGames and pursue my own path in game development. We talked about the scale of game titles, but especially when it comes to AAA titles, the aspect of not being able to fail commercially becomes stronger. And I think this draws a line at things like being dependent on individual people. So there you go. This has to do with scale as well as creative freedom. You could argue in some ways that this is a direct consequence to the symptoms that have caused the AAA or the gaming industry bubble to burst. When asked if Clovers could work with Platinum again, we don't think it's strange at all if something like that happens. I think the strength of Clovers is creating the core of the game and creating plans from scratch. I think it's a natural possibility. I mean, Kamiya says that, but now that I know that he was the one that came up with the Clovers Inc. name, and that even though technically he didn't start this company during the non-compete agreement with Inaba at PlatinumGames, this was only 2 months after his non-compete agreement ended. He creates a company that is the same spiritual successor name to the old company Clover Studio that Inaba was the CEO of, and now is working on titles that Clover Games worked with Capcom 20 years ago. This is kind of hilarious, actually. They end the interview saying they're hiring and that they're just kind of scoping out people that they know are cool enough to join and have the same mindset as the 4 C's, the Sea Lovers. Again, I think this whole situation says a lot about the game industry, especially the history of PlatinumGames that started with rogue Capcom developers. It's hard not to think that there's any bad blood if it took 3 months that Kamiya, as a director and not as a vice president of Platinum Games, could not agree with Inaba to the point that there was no agree to disagree. He just left with no plan at all to work in games, and joked about moving back in with his parents. But with many people at Platinum Games saying that they want to work with Kamiya again, and that Kamiya is the reason they worked at Platinum Games, and then these Platinum game directors suddenly delisting that they work at Platinum Games on social media, I don't know, it's not looking good for Platinum Games and the direction that Inaba is taking it. Guys, if you made it this far and listening to me ramble, please leave a like on the video. I cannot overstate how much that actually helps out. The game industry at this point is you either die a Kickstarter legend or you live long enough to see yourself become a Game Pass promoter. Okay, bye-bye.